When the guns finally fell silent across Europe, the world thought the worst was over. But in the Austrian hills near the quiet village of St. Jorgen, another kind of silence lingered, one that felt heavier than war itself. U.S. Army soldiers, weary from months of combat, arrived at a place called Gusen, a subcamp of Mauthausen. The air carried the metallic tang of decay. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys that had no business burning. The gates creaked open, revealing not an army but a graveyard that still breathed. There were barracks made of rot, towers of stone dust, and a strange stillness, as if even the wind was afraid to move. The men expected to find prisoners. Instead, they found nothing but echoes, until one of them shouted, "Movement!" From the dark mouths of the tunnels carved deep into the hillside, shapes began to appear. Not soldiers, not ghosts. Survivors, skeletal figures dragging themselves into the sunlight like creatures who'd forgotten the world above still existed. The soldiers froze. The silence of battlefields they knew. But this silence was different. This was the silence of men who had lived in the dark too long. And among them, one man still carried a chain. But what the soldiers didn't know yet was that the chain he held wasn't a shackle. It was a story the world had almost buried with him. The tunnels of Gusen were like veins beneath the earth, carved by human hands that never stopped bleeding. For years, men had been sent down into the darkness to dig, to break, to die. They worked by torchlight, breathing dust so thick it coated their lungs like cement. The Nazis called it production. The prisoners called it the underworld. Every strike of a pickaxe was a prayer that went unanswered. Men collapsed where they stood, and when they didn't rise, the overseers simply built over them. The tunnels didn't just swallow the dead, they grew from them. When the Americans entered those passageways, the light from their flashlights revealed walls scarred with fingernail marks, names scratched into stone, dates, final messages no one was ever meant to see. And somewhere deep inside, a rusted chain lay half buried in dust, its iron links worn smooth from years of friction against human wrists. That same chain would soon see the light again, carried by a man who refused to leave it behind. He could have dropped it and walked away a free man, but instead he chose to carry the weight of every ghost left in those tunnels. He emerged slowly, dragging his feet across the gravel, a shadow among the living dead. His body trembled with every step, yet his grip on the chain never loosened. His clothes were torn beyond recognition, a patchwork of cloth and dirt barely clinging to his bones. His eyes, hollow yet defiant, stared straight into the faces of the men who'd come to liberate him. One American soldier, young and wide-eyed, couldn't help but whisper, "Is he still chained?" But as they looked closer, they realized the truth. The man wasn't bound. He chose to hold the chain. It clinked softly as he moved, a metallic whisper that seemed to carry a language only he understood. He stopped in front of them, breathing shallowly, like every inhale was a reminder that he'd survived when others hadn't. The soldier stepped forward, his voice barely steady. "Why do you still carry that, sir?" The man looked down at the rusted iron, then up at the soldier. "So I never forget," he rasped. "So the world never forgets." The chain trembled in his hands, not from weakness, but from meaning. The soldiers had seen death, but they had never seen someone hold on to it so fiercely. Until now. The soldiers gathered around him, men who'd stormed beaches, crossed minefields, and stared death in the face without flinching. Yet now they stood utterly still, The chain in the survivor's hands wasn't just metal. It was testimony. Every link had known pain. Every stain told a story. He raised it slightly, and the sunlight caught on the rust. The faint sound, a fragile clinking, echoed through the courtyard, sharp as memory itself. To the soldiers, it felt as if the air had thickened. One of them, a hardened sergeant, later said it was the only time he'd felt like he was standing inside someone else's grief. The man whispered in broken English, "This was mine, but it is not mine alone." Then, lowering his voice, he added, "They took everything from us. Food, names, light. But not this, not the memory. I carry it for those who can't." And in that moment, the rusted chain became something more powerful than any monument ever could. No flag, no medal, no parade could ever speak louder than that chain, and yet its story was only beginning. Days later, the Americans ventured deeper into the tunnels. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The chambers seemed endless, corridors carved with desperate hands. Scattered tools lay where men had dropped them in death. On one wall, a faint handprint, preserved in limestone dust, as if the earth itself had tried to remember. A sergeant knelt beside a broken helmet and whispered, "They built their own graves." The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence. They found records, too, neat Nazi handwriting listing names, ages, nationalities. Then a word repeated overs, and over, verstorben, deceased. Each name a man, each number a heartbeat that had stopped underground. And somewhere in that blackness, they found a second chain, still anchored to the wall. Only this one had no key. That discovery would lead them back to the survivor, and to a truth even darker than the tunnels themselves. When the soldiers returned, they found him sitting near the barracks, staring at the horizon. His chain lay beside him, coiled like a sleeping serpent. One of the men knelt down and said softly, "We found another chain. Looks like yours." The survivor didn't look up. "Yes," he said, "that one belonged to my brother." The words hit harder than any gunfire. "He was stronger than me," the man continued. "He told me to live, to remember. When he fell, I took his chain. I swore I'd carry it until someone saw it, someone free." He looked up at the soldier then, and though his face was sunken, his eyes burned with a clarity that silence couldn't kill. "You saw it now," he said. "That means he's free too." The soldier nodded, speechless. In that moment, the chain became more than proof. It became connection. The living carrying the weight of the lost. But even freedom couldn't wash away what Gusen had carved into their souls, because memory doesn't die when the gates open. After the liberation, the Americans ordered the tunnels sealed. Locals said the ground itself was cursed, that at night the hills seemed to breathe. Sometimes soldiers swore they heard faint sounds, like iron dragging over stone. Others said it was just the wind through the tunnels. But one officer, a quiet man from Illinois, kept a piece of stone from Gusen. On it, he scratched 2 words: "Never again." Years later, he'd tell his grandson it wasn't just a camp, it was a factory that made ghosts. And the chain, the one carried by the survivor, was never seen again. Some said he left it buried near the entrance. Others claimed he carried it all the way home, wherever that was. But the truth? The chain never left Gusen. It lived in the stories, in the nightmares, in the silence that followed. Yet even decades later, when the world thought it had moved on, Gusen would remind everyone that history doesn't rest easy beneath the earth. Unlike Auschwitz or Dachau, Gusen was almost erased from memory. The tunnels were sealed, the barracks torn down, and the land sold piece by piece. For years, no memorial stood there. Tourists drove past, unaware they were crossing ground soaked in sorrow. But the survivors remembered. They wrote letters, gave testimonies, and spoke in broken voices before courts that could never deliver real justice. One survivor wrote, "They tried to bury our pain, but the earth refused to keep their secret." Historians who later uncovered the records called Gusen the camp the world forgot. And yet, every May, someone would leave a small iron chain on the hillside. No name, no flowers, just the sound of metal against stone, whispering, "We are still here." Who left those chains behind? And what promise still bound them 80 years after liberation? Years passed, and the world rebuilt itself. Cities rose again, markets opened, people danced. But for those who had seen Gusen, silence was never just silence anymore. The survivor who once carried the chain lived a quiet life somewhere in Europe. He never gave interviews. He never wrote a book. But neighbors said they could sometimes hear him in his garden, striking a hammer against metal, as if shaping something invisible. When asked what he was making, he simply said, "Memory." In truth, he was forging small iron links, one by one, identical to the ones he once carried. Each one was given away to friends, strangers, or the children of other survivors. He never explained why, but everyone who received one said the same thing. It felt heavy, heavier than it should have been. Decades later, one of those links would resurface in a place no one expected, and reopen the story the world had tried to forget. In 1992, a group of local students explored the old hills near St. Jorgen. The entrances to the tunnels had long been sealed, but erosion had opened a narrow gap. Inside, the air was still thick and stale, as if time had been trapped there. Their flashlights cut through layers of dust, illuminating bits of machinery, helmets, and rusted tracks. And then, something small, half buried in the gravel. A fragment of iron chain, no longer connected to anything. They took it to a museum in Linz, thinking it was nothing more than a relic of war. But when the curator saw it, he froze. He whispered, "I've seen this before." In his archives was a black-and-white photograph, one taken in May 1945, of a survivor stepping into the light, holding a chain that looked exactly the same. That photo had always been a mystery. Now, it had found its missing link. But the real revelation wasn't the chain itself. It was the letter found buried beside it, sealed in a small tin box. Inside the tin box was a note written in trembling handwriting, dated June 1946, 1 year after liberation. It read, "If someone finds this, remember, these tunnels are not just stone. They are graves, and they are lessons. Do not let them become silent again. I carried the chain for my brother. Now I leave it here for the world. When men forget, cruelty begins again." The signature was smudged by moisture, but one word remained visible: Jakob. Historians searched archives, records, testimonies, but there was no complete record of any prisoner named Jakob who survived Gusen. Some said he must have changed his name. Others believed he never left Austria. But the letter's message outlived its author. Within months of the discovery, whispers began that the chain of Gusen had started to appear in other places, as if it refused to rest. A journalist in Poland wrote about a museum visitor who left behind a small rusted chain link near the entrance. No note, no explanation. In France, a memorial guard found one placed neatly on a stone engraved with "Unknown Victim." And in Vienna, someone mailed a single iron link to the Parliament building wrapped in black cloth with a line written in charcoal. "Never again begins with remembering." No one ever claimed responsibility, but every few years another link appeared, each one different, each one unmistakably handmade. Was it a movement, a tribute, or something deeper, a tradition carried forward by descendants who'd inherited more than just bloodlines, but promises? Whatever it was, the world began to take notice. Until one day, a young man arrived in Gusen with a story that would close the circle once and for all. It was May 8, 2015, 70 years since liberation. Among the small crowd gathered for a remembrance ceremony stood a man in his 30s, quiet, holding something wrapped in cloth. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped forward to the memorial stone. His voice trembled. "My grandfather never spoke of this place, but he left me something before he died." He unwrapped the cloth. Inside, a rusted length of iron chain, worn smooth by time. Gasps rippled through the crowd. He looked down at it, then up at the old tunnels sealed behind the trees. "He told me," the man said softly, "that his father carried this out of the darkness, and that I must bring it back to the light." He laid it at the base of the stone. The chain clinked softly, just as it had 70 years ago. The sound was faint, but everyone heard it, like a heartbeat echoing from beneath the earth, reminding them the story wasn't over yet. After the ceremony, a historian approached the young man. "Do you know what this chain means?" she asked. He nodded. "It means we don't get to forget." She smiled sadly. "Most people want to move on, to let history rest." He shook his head. "History doesn't rest. It waits." The crowd dispersed slowly, but the chain remained, rusted, quiet, and alive. In the afternoon light, it gleamed faintly, as though each link held a reflection of every face that had once looked toward freedom and vowed never to forget. And as the sun dipped below the hills, a breeze swept across the grass. The faint sound of metal against stone echoed once more. That night, locals swore they saw a light flicker inside the sealed tunnel. Just once, then disappear. No one ever proved what caused that light. Maybe it was moonlight catching on glass. Maybe it was memory, refusing to die. But the story of the chain lives on, in classrooms, in museums, in whispered prayers and documentaries. It is a symbol now, not of captivity, but of conscience. Of what happens when the world chooses silence, and what hope looks like when someone finally speaks again. They say the man who first carried the chain walked into the sunlight trembling, but unbroken. That the sound of the links was the sound of history itself, fragile, heavy, impossible to forget. And perhaps that's the truest part of it all. The chain was never just metal. It was a vow that outlasted the men who made it. A vow that still whispers in the wind that passes over Gusen Hill. Never again. Never forget. Because as long as someone remembers, the chain and everything it stands for will never truly be broken.